All right, guys, so here is the X-Trail in bits again. Um, this time for a different reason. It's slightly leaky injector there. Got new seals, so we're good. But that brings me to the EGR. Now, this is a question I'm asking. So your EGR takes your exhaust gas, it runs it through this cooler, and then it puts it into an EGR valve, right? And that valve allows at certain RPMs certain amounts of exhaust gas to go back into the cylinder, right? Or back into the intake, which goes back into the cylinder. Now, this is the bit that I'm kind of asking, is Trump really right here? Because I've got a few questions on this. Now, a lot of people are going to think that, they're reburning what is uncombusted out of the exhaust. Even I thought that, it'll have a bit of research on it. And it's not reburning, the stuff is burnt. Um, what it's doing is it's taking that exhaust gas, banging it into the intake manifold, and those exhaust gases are physically harder. They take more energy to heat up than regular air, right? And so what it's trying to do is maintain the temperature in the manifold, okay, and bring that temperature down, because a higher temperature causes the oxygen in the air and the nitrogen in the air to combust and form NOx gases. And they've now decided that NOx gases are the problem, right? So they put this EGR on cars, right? So this is a whole different system that they've added on right in the back here, where it's not accessible at all, where they should say this is a serviceable product. Let's put it in a place where you can service it. It's not at all. So you have a costly repair bill when you have to clean your EGR. Now, this car is, it's a 2002, so it's 24 years old. Call it 25 years old, right? My first question is, that little bit, now, when it comes to a cleaner combustion, in my books, if your air and fuel ratio is correct and you get a cleaner burn, you are going to have less emissions going out into the atmosphere because it's a cleaner burn. So that temperature has to be optimized. Now what they're doing is they're cooling it down, right? By adding in this contraption called an EGR. Now this is old Nissan, so you can't get spares. And if you can, they're exorbitantly expensive. It's cheaper to run a Bugatti Veyron than it is any Nissan. So you're already at a disadvantage with Nissan. And I'll tell you, for example, that little 80 amp engine fuse is 720 or 780 or something like that for that little fuse at Nissan. 780, that's almost 25 pounds. I mean, that's ridiculous. Their high pressure diesel pump is 50,000 Rand. The car is only worth 30,000 Rand book value. And that is worth more than the car. So if that isn't them forcing you to buy another vehicle, I don't know what is. Now, there are two components in the engine that allow it to pass emissions control tests. And the one is the EGR system that makes lower NOx, and the other one is your catalytic converter, or DPF, on diesel that sits down in the exhaust. So let's hold that thought for a second. What happens with NOx? NOx happens when you burn nitrogen and oxygen, right? You get NOx, which are harmful for the environment. So this little car is going to burn nitrogen and oxygen, and it's going to put it in the environment, right? And if you put an EGR valve in it, it's going to burn a slightly less NOx, but it's still going to burn, but only slightly less. Now, how much is that slightly less compared to one lightning strike? That is my first question. How much is that slightly less amount that the EGR prevents this car from putting that amount of NOx into the environment. Less than a singular lightning strike. Now, we live in Africa where you get electrical storms. There is just tons and tons. The sky lights up with lightning like you've never seen in your life. And quite frankly, in my opinion, I haven't done the maths. That amount of NOx produced by the atmosphere itself, by the earth itself, is way more than this car will ever produce in its entire life. Now, the other thing is, these environmentalists, they're all saying, yeah, NOx this, that, and environment this, that, but have they actually done their maths? Because I'm telling you something, when this guy goes on holiday, he's getting in a big Boeing 747 or Airbus, and that jet is going to burn more NOx because of those much higher temperatures than his car or his savings on his EGR is ever going to produce an entire year. He's going to use that in a couple of hours on one holiday. He's going to fulfill that quota of NOx. So was Trump right? Was he right about, let's start off with the earth, right? The earth has gone through 5 or 6 environmental changes, complete drastic environmental changes in its entire lifespan of being the earth, which is a long time before us humans, right? A hell of a long time. It's gone from ice ages to molten lava everywhere, deserts, you name it. And yes, I do think that what we are putting into the atmosphere is not good for it. Okay, so I'm not saying it's not good for it. I'm just doing some comparisons here. So they're adding on a catalytic converter, and they're adding on this EGR valve. Now, the one thing I find quite unsurprising, to be honest, we're not doing product placement here, very unsurprising, is that all your components, for example, this EGR valve, you can't even get it. If you can get it, it's going to cost a fortune. All your components that are related to emissions control are exponentially more expensive. I don't even want to know the price of one of these compared to the other very expensive Nissan prices, but they are exponentially more expensive than, for example, your usual mechanical parts, including injectors and you name it. Now, so if your injectors aren't working, they are going to do more harm to the environment than that CO2 or EGR, whatever the hell it is going to do, right? It's going to do a lot more harm. So that's my first problem. Now, they say that your DPF, your catalytic converter, your DPF known as diesel, is made of very expensive chemicals. But De Beers also said that diamonds were very expensive because they were very rare. But actually they were stockpiling a common rock and they were marketing it well. So, is he right? Is this just marketing? When you do the maths, someone is actually probably very terrible at maths, or they are very good at marketing, because they're going for all these emissions controls on cars that are hellish expensive to maintain or to replace, instead of limiting them, cost-wise, and saying it must be serviceable, it cannot cost more than X percent of the value of the car. They're not doing that. So they're taking some unrealistic figures, like a difference. I'm talking about the difference in having a DPF versus not having, or EGR versus not having an EGR, versus the amount of NOx in one lightning strike versus the amount of NOx in one Boeing 747 flying overhead, or any of that. And then there's another factor here. These things become debilitatingly expensive to run your car. So what the guys do is they just blank it off because they don't care. I have a different issue with that. when you look at this car and you start right at the front, it's got a stainless steel nudge bar. This is all plastic. This is all plastic. This is steel, right? That steel has to come out of the ground. That plastic has to be made from oil. All of this has to be made from oil. The amount of resources into going to make one single little plastic clip that has to be made from oil, turn into plastic, injection molded, all of these massive factories producing huge amounts of NOx in the environment. So you can scrap your car because it fails to pass emissions. You have to scrap your car so that they can sell you a new one. That's why I ask, is this someone that's very bad at maths or someone that's very good at marketing? Because they are going for the everyday man has got a vehicle. And that's who they're going for, because that's who they know cannot fight back. An industry can say, fine, we just won't produce plastic anymore. You might be watching this video and thinking, yes, but how much of that plastic is recyclable? Well, you may notice that plastic recycling plants close down when the price of oil is lower than a certain amount. They close down. Why? Because it is not economically viable to recycle plastics versus making new plastics, because plastics are made from oil. That's the first thing. And most of these cars are all plastic. All of them, even engine components, like your clutch, master cylinder, slave cylinder. There's still a steel one. New Volkswagen stuff, plastic. All right? It's all plastic. That's the first thing. So what they're trying to do is get your car to fail. Your MOT or whatever it is, coming in new emissions control. So you have to buy a new one because you cannot afford these repairs on these so-called expensive components. I mean, that stuff is not expensive. It's expensive because it's important to these emissions control people. That's why it's expensive. Like diamonds are important to an engagement, so is an EGR or DPF or catalytic converter important to you keeping the car. And these are not expensive. It's a little valve, but because it's part of emissions control, your manufacturers have boosted the prices of this to the point that you actually cannot replace it. So you either have to scrap the car or you blank it off because you need a car. And what are you going to go? Paying the price of a new car. Now, how much goes into manufacturing a new car? Manufacturing a new car, because if I bypass that and drive this car another 5 years, I'm telling you right now that the difference in NOx that it will put in the environment is a hell of a lot less than manufacturing and running a new car for 5 years. Its warranty is only going to be 2 years anyway. And then it's going to start packing up and then they're going to sell it to someone who's going to bypass it anyway. So this is my question in life. Oh, before I even ask that question, one of the disadvantages of having an EGR is that it is putting more exhaust back into the intake manifold, and then it goes into the cylinders, and then it gets burnt. But not all of it gets burnt. A lot of that carbon goes down past the pistons because they're not perfectly sealed, and they go into the crankcase and it goes into the oil. So essentially what is happening is that you're adding more of this to your oil. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out, let me try and get that into focus, that mixed with any lubricant will actually turn into a grinding paste, right? That is going to turn into a grinding paste, making you have to change your oil more frequently because you have an EGR on. Every liter of oil has to come out of the ground, and the resources used to get that out of the ground is phenomenally unbelievable, from every single truck, from the drilling rig to every truck, to the site foreman, the drilling foreman, all the drilling, all their transport, all of that going into getting more oil out of the ground, because you have to put more oil in your engine, because some environmentalists said it's better to put on an EGR valve. How does that make sense? How does that make sense? It brings me down to one question alone, apart from the money, apart from the marketing, apart from the bleeding hearts environmentalists who still drive a car and fly a plane and get on ships to go and help people and do everything. My question is, was Trump right? Was he right about climate change being the biggest con of the century? I don't know, guys. I'd love to hear your opinion. But when I look at this car, yes, if we bypass this, we bypass this. Doesn't matter, nothing. You know, you look at the cars on the road, they belch out smoke. Nobody gets pulled over. So we will get this car running efficiently. And I'd like to see some real numbers on what difference versus an extra 5 liters of oil. What does it cost the environment to give you an extra 5 liters of oil to put in this car? Whereas you changing it now twice as much because you have an EGR to make environmentalists happy. I don't know, guys. Love to hear your comments. Thank you for watching.